This is an interview with Mike Kofman, a military analyst, an expert on the Russian armed forces, and a senior fellow at the Carnegie Institute for International Peace. He's someone who knows more about the Russian military than almost anyone else, and so we tried to get to the bottom of how dangerous, strong, and capable the Russian armed forces actually are. We talked about their recruiting and manpower issues, equipment losses, and performance on the battlefield, and whether they will emerge from the war weaker or stronger. How long will it take them to recover, and how much of a threat they will pose to NATO, as well as about who's winning the war at the moment, and much, much more. The corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. And this podcast is also supported by generous supporters on Patreon, without whom the podcast probably couldn't exist, and that you can join to get access to full-length ad-free episodes and bunch of other perks. And now, enjoy the conversation. Okay, so welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I do have a lot of quite diverse questions, but I think since we're going to be talking about the Russian military and the war in Ukraine, probably a good place to start would be to ask you, how do you see the situation at the moment? Because in my view, and I guess the mainstream view, is that for months, Russia has been gaining incrementally parts of the territory, the relatively small parts, at a very high cost and at a very slow pace without really being able to gain control over any major cities so far. Is that a correct assessment in your view? And have you noticed anything that would suggest that this is changing or should change anytime soon?
Yeah, so the Russian rate of gain increased quite visibly from July to about December of last year. But the way Russia's been fighting is such that they're not able to achieve operationally significant breakthroughs, right? Because you have most of the forces fighting a small combat packets deployed on the battlefield. So even though you have a lot of force in play in a very lengthy front line, around maybe 1,200 kilometers or a bit more, at the point of contact, the forces fighting each other are fairly small-sized units, right? Because the way the war is being fought tactically at that level, it really heavily privileges dispersal. So you have this kind of mixture of dispersed infantry attacking, lightly motorized infantry, mechanized assaults. Occasionally they get sizable, about the size of a company or so, or a little bigger, but this is pretty rare. It's a pretty rare feature in the war at this point. Now, the way the Russian military had been fighting, it's allowed them to make steady gains by pressing to the front, and it's come at very significant costs to equipment, but more in particular manpower. And the steady pressure, though, has also, on the other hand, created some dilemmas for Ukraine, particularly when it comes to manpower and force generation. We can talk about them a bit later, maybe. No, they've not taken any major cities insofar as you can think, but I don't know why that's necessarily kind of a feature. One of the biggest, what that's something you would focus on, because one of the things when you look at a war, you say, okay, is this a war principally based around maneuver? If it is, then territory changing hands and big breakthroughs are what you're looking for. If this is much more of a positional war, where the driving dynamic is attrition in the character of the fight, then territory changing hands is much more of a lagging indicator, which you're trying to figure out what's happening to the two forces. Because one force can be depleting the other or not, and the territory might not change hands very much, and then you'll suddenly have maybe a collapse at the front line, like what happened to Russians in Kharkiv of 2022. And that'll be a lagging indicator as to what was going on with the Russian forces at that time, right? So, and of course, it does take an offensive to make that happen, but you won't see it coming if you're not focusing on the situation within the force itself. So the way the Russian military is fighting right now, it's clear that they are actually trying to envelop Покrovsk and go around it rather than accepting a battle for the city. But they still have a long way to go to even capture the rest of Donetsk. One of the biggest questions is it's not clear if they really want to focus on Donetsk right now, or now that they're kind of past Покrovsk and on the western edge of it, are they going to push into Dnipro Oblast and then try to maybe come in over the top of Zaporizhzhia defenses? So it's not clear what direction the Russian offensives are going to take in eastern Ukraine. In Kursk, they've slowly eaten away at the salient, and I think Ukraine maybe is holding around 40 to 30% of what they originally took in Kursk, but still holding. I think surprisingly, they They managed to hold on there. Bottom line, the Ukrainian military has proven quite resilient, given that Russia held the material advantage since fall of 2023 and has had the initiative along much of the front line, right? So I think last year was probably a rather disappointing year for the Russian forces, given how much they invested in making gains. On the Ukrainian side of the equation, I would say that the worst case scenarios didn't take place. You didn't see a collapse of the front, and Ukraine had, at least tactically, a successful offensive in Kursk. The best case scenarios didn't take place either in terms of restoring the offensive combat potential to the force or changing the overall dynamic, right? Because if you've kind of seen the war the same way I am, since the failure of the summer offensive of 2023, you're probably seeing a war where Russia's held the initiative along most of the front for the last almost 15 months or so, and the material advantage, but that advantage hasn't proven decisive. Right. And lastly, the challenge you always have in looking at war is that the war goes in phases, and each phase sets up the next. It's very easy to fall into the trap of extrapolating from the phase you're in and assuming that's what the rest of the war is going to go like. And so it's important to look at factors that encourage continuity, right? But also those that might lead to change and to anticipate change, right? Because that's also likely to happen, even in the third year of the war.
And do you see any of those indicators that would either suggest continuity or suggest a change in the patterns that we have been seeing so far?
To me, the battlefield outcomes are, of course, dictated by that fight at the tactical level, but I often think that there's a tendency to fixate on that. And what's more significant in a prolonged conventional war are the bigger factors that sort of drive the dynamic, right? To me, those are the ability of both sides to deal with and withstand attrition, right? To what extent are they reconstituting their forces? Defense industrial mobilization or external material support, right? In Ukraine, it's maybe more external material support. In Russia, it might be more Russia's own defense industrial mobilization output versus what they're pulling from stocks versus what they get from North Korea and other countries. And lastly, adaptation. Because through the course of the war, part of the reason I've been going to Ukraine about every 3.5 months is if you haven't been there for about 4 months, what you know about the war starts to get dated. There's a great deal of tactical adaptation and innovation and how the war is unfolding. And so both sides iterate from each other, right? Especially if they have the capacity to both adapt, innovate, and copy the tactics of the other side that they think work for them. You quickly see what one side is doing, proliferating very quickly across the front, and then being taken, and then being used by the other side as well, in terms of both technology and tactics. Because both Russian and Ukrainian forces are learning from each other, and people tend to adopt what they think works, right? And generally, this is not true in all cases. It's a very broad brush. Generally, the pattern of the war has been that Ukraine's been done better overall in bottom-up tactical innovation, and Russia's tended to do better in scaling and deployment, right? And just partly because of industrial capacity, and also because once they actually decide on the system or certain things, they're able to scale a bit better. It's not the same. It's not the case in everything, but that's kind of a broad brush comparison. And both sides have adapted to the technology and tactics deployed by the other, right? In answer to your question, what do I really look for? To me, on the Russian side, it's material constraints, right? Equipment. We know that they're primarily drawing from storage. That's going to be an issue for them in the second half of 2025, right? And what that really does is it affects how the Russian military fights. They're not going to run out of equipment, right? There's not going to be a point where tank counter or infantry fighting vehicle counter suddenly reaches zero, But it substantially affects how they fight, and it's clear that since the Battle of Diivka in late 23 or early 24, they've been trying to manage material losses to the force and avoid fighting in a way, avoiding large-scale maneuvers that lose a lot of equipment because they don't have the force quality or the enablers to break through a prepared defense backed by mass precision. Because Ukrainian military is quite good at the tactical level, right? So what the Russian military found is when they try kind of large-scale combined arms maneuver, they lose a lot of equipment, but it doesn't result in substantially improved gains, if that makes sense. And if you do that enough times and you lose enough equipment, then eventually I think what happened to them is they figured out that it's not going to work out for them. They're not able to put those pieces together. On the Ukrainian side, I think the biggest issue Ukraine's had overall is reconstitution, force management, and manpower. Right? Earlier in the war, first years, the bigger factors were availability of ammunition, fire's advantage, air defense capabilities, and what have you. I'm giving a broad brush and sort of who's producing more drones. At this point in the war, Russia and Ukraine have notional parity in tactical strike drones at the front. The Russian advantage in fires is not significant or decisive either. It's maybe also close to notional parity. And when we say notional parity, it's when you have maybe a 3 or 2-to-1 fires advantage, but it's not that decisive. If you look in 2022, Russian fires advantage during this period in spring of 2022 is more like 10, 15-to-1 on the front. And the biggest asymmetry you see is manpower, that Russia's been replacing its losses and expanding the force and conducting rotations at the level of regiments consistently, and the Ukrainian manning levels have been declining since fall of 2023, and mobilization has really struggled as a process. And some of the force management choices, I think, exacerbated this over the course of 2024. And I'm sure you know my views on that if you've followed some of my writing over the past year. So this, to me, increasingly is one of the biggest issues because, goes on this, while tactically very successful, Ukrainian military has that part of the force has really improved, particularly in integration between drone units, electronic warfare, what have you. So tactical level, Ukrainian military has gotten better and better, right? But that is not enough to compensate for problems with the fundamental. Okay? So the problems with fundamentals, if you have issues with force generation, if you have issues with fortification construction, defense and maintenance of it, if you have issues with force management and command and control that are unaddressed for too long, and I think everybody in Ukraine sees this clear-eyed, the qualitative advantage of the military at the tactical level is only going to hold that for so long, right? And that's one of the challenges that I've seen over 2024.
If you're enjoying this podcast, chances are that you like to know what's going on in the world of geopolitics. And if that's the case, you might want to sign up to my newsletter. There's a lot of news on geopolitics, but most of it just doesn't actually matter. It's just chasing headlines, emotions, and breaking news. What I want to do is to try to separate all this noise and find the signal. The stuff that actually does matter and will have consequences months and years down the line. And so in every edition, I pick out 3 things that do matter and explain why and what will be their future impact. You can find the link in the description, so check it out and sign up to stay informed. And I guess at some point the quantity might take over the quality, but you've hinted at 2 things that I wanted to actually talk about separately, both the main issue on the Russian side and the main issue on the Ukrainian side. And if you look at both of them, if we kind of compare them together, if you look at the lack of equipment as we go into 2025 on the Russian side, and I guess mainly the lack of soldiers on the Ukrainian side, what, in your view, will be the bigger detriment if you compare the 2 of them? Because that might be a way to sort of answer how the war might go in the coming months.
Okay, so let me touch on both those. Russia's not so much lacking in equipment. A lot of equipment that Russia pulled out storage it used to expand the force. It's not the case that all the equipment went from storage just to replace battle losses. The Russian ground force grew dramatically after partial mobilization in 2022. So it's a much larger force than what it was when Russia began the war. Now, a lot of that equipment might be older, but it's there nonetheless. That said, Russia does have visible deficits in key categories. For example, artillery tubes, things of that nature. It is affecting how the Russian military fights, it's true. Ukraine also has real issues with equipment because the West transferred a veritable zoo of different types of equipment, different platform systems, and without a great plan for how to maintain its operational readiness in Ukraine over the course of this war, right? So you can have lots of equipment, but the readiness rate is really low because of all the challenges of maintenance, logistics, and sustaining this kit. So that's a more challenge on the Ukrainian side, but Ukraine's main problem is definitely not equipment. That's very clear. Ukraine's problem is manpower. And it's not a problem in that Ukraine itself lacks manpower. It's a challenge that mobilization is now replacing losses and force management decisions haven't led to the right outcomes to sustaining manning across the force. And most importantly, the challenge is deficit of combat infantry, right? Here's the thing. Lots of folks are willing to fight. Lots of people are willing to go fight in a drone unit, in a support position, what have you. But infantry is seen as a one-way ticket, almost a death sentence. Because when you're mobilized, if you go into infantry, there's no way off the front line unless you're killed or wounded. And it's increasingly seen as the job you end up with because you didn't have connections or you weren't smart enough to kind of get out of it. And that's a very negative trend because while Ukraine is very successfully compensating for lack of infantry at the front with drones and it's working as a big force multiplier, that's not a sustainable approach. Like at the end of the day, what the war shows, to me at least, despite all the claims you read regularly about how war's been revolutionized, it hasn't. Most military revolutions, when declared, do not arrive. That's just my own perspective on it. You still see that despite the so-called revolutionary aspects of this war, the biggest issues are manpower, force reconstitution, force management, and a deficit of combat infantry or deficit, let's say, of material, of armored fighting vehicles, or the quality of the force itself. And having all the drones in the world isn't compensating for that. If anything, it exacerbates the positional and relatively static nature of the fight. All right. So that's kind of the way I look at it. I think that on the Ukrainian side, definitely one of the biggest factors will be whether or not Ukraine can stabilize its manpower situation, because without that, it will not be able to stabilize the front. And on the Russian side, it's not so much a means-ends gap. Russia began the war with a very visible means-ends gap in the sense that the political objectives they were trying to achieve, the military capability available was clearly not sufficient or not able to achieve those objectives, right? There's a big gap between their goals in this war and the military ability they had. You could argue that that's still there, right? Depending on how you assess Russian objectives in this war. But what to me is more visible in the last year and a half is more of a ways-ends gap, which is that the way the Russian military is fighting, it's very hard for them to get to those objectives. And it's a costly way of trying to make those gains. That said, it is a trade-off in that it has allowed Russia to sustain pressure on the front for a very long period of time. And it's likely going to enable them to sustain this pressure well into 2025. So you could say, no, they're not able to achieve big breakthroughs. They're not conducting offensives in the way Ukraine conducted the Kursk offensive, right? But on the other hand, you can see that Russia has been sustaining pressure on the front since fall of 2023 and had been making not just steady, but visibly increased gains for the last 6 months of last year.
Well, what do you think are the objectives? Because that's one of the things that's kind of unclear to me. If I was asked, I would probably say just to kind of keep doing this same thing as they are doing and keep pushing for as long as they have the people and equipment for doing that. But what are the objectives in your view?
I mean, if you ask me, I'd say obviously the big picture objective for Russia is to destroy Ukraine as a viable state, right? And that any agreement or settlement with Russia, to me, I'm very skeptical that that's going to end the war because of the maximalist aims Russia has. The minimalist aims are focused on territory, taking the rest of the Donbass, right? But that's not what this war was about. And that's why I also try to convey to folks that focusing on the battlefield outcomes is important, but the war's not going to be decided by who controls the next 20 kilometers of Donetsk, right? We would agree very, very easily, I think, that that's not what the war was about, and that's not how the war is going to be settled. And whoever controls, does Russia take Pokrovsk or not, is not going to be deterministic of the settlement or the ceasefire that ends this war, right? It won't substantially add to Russia's advantage either, because the war wasn't about Pokrovsk. So these are often tactical or operational level objectives, but not much more. Right? To me, the war can be periodized, and this might be the wrong way to periodize it, but in two ways. One is in phases, different phases and periods of the war, right? Who had the initiative, who was doing an offensive, and what have you. But the other way is that you kind of have two wars. You have the first kind of 30 days from February 24th to March 25th, which is a very, very peculiar, almost military operation that's based around the concept of a coup de main, where the strategy is that the military operation is going to come on top of an intelligence operation, be complementary to it. And the force employment will be fundamentally irrational, not just from the standpoint of Russian doctrine, but from the standpoint of how any military would be used. If you look at the forces arrayed and how they were employed, we actually know a great deal now about what happened in those first 30 days. why Russian Rosguardia and National Guard were in the lead of some columns, why they expected to just advance down roads and isolate cities, and why they had the force package they had given the size of Ukraine. What they expected to happen in Kiev, and all the things that went wrong for them. But it wasn't a typical sort of conventional invasion or joint force operation. And that so-called special military operation ends disastrously for Russia on March 25th. Okay, and the objective of it was to install a pro-Russian regime in Ukraine and occupy most of, if not all of Ukraine. We know Russian goals. Right? I don't think that those are viable objectives for Russia, and I don't think that is ultimately still Russia's goals now. I think after March 25th, the Russian goal had been still to impose its will on Ukraine, but since it's not in a position to return to Kiev or to install a pro-Russian government in Ukraine, it is to, one, take the parts of Ukraine that they've annexed formally in September of 2022, but most importantly, destroy Ukraine's viability as a state, right? And so the rest of the war after March 25th, if you kind of think about it this way, the first 30 days are about whether or not Ukraine would remain a sovereign state and independent as a nation with its own identity. And I think Ukraine and Ukrainians achieved that. Meaning, I am deeply skeptical. I could be wrong on this because, look, this is a war that could well set up a third war. It's a continuation war of the 2014-2015 war. And what I say now could look quite wrong 5-10 years from now if there's a third war and Russia's somehow successful in this third war, right? We can't speak to how future wars will go. But I think Russia simply lacks the military capability to try to pursue those objectives now. However, the rest of the war is really about what will be the borders of a sovereign Ukraine, right? Will that country be economically viable, right? And to what extent will Russia be able to impose its will on Ukraine? Things like forced neutrality, what have you, the things that they were demanding back in Istanbul, right? Weimar Republic type restrictions on the Ukrainian military. These things are unacceptable to Ukraine. They're still in question. Sorry, it's a bit of a lengthy answer, but I think we have to walk through how the war began, what the Russian goals were, to what they are now. And people still debate this, right? None of us live in the heads of Russian decision making, and no matter how many articles I read that say this is what Putin really wants, I'm deeply skeptical that folks know what Putin really wants other than Putin.
Well, if that's, I agree that it makes sense that those would be Russian objectives, but then I would probably also say that Russia is not very successful in achieving them, especially the second one, and basically destroying the existence of the Ukrainian state or denying its existence in any way possible, because it doesn't seem to me like waging the war this way would really move Russia closer to this goal, unless it would be trying to literally bleed Ukraine out of its people.
So the honest answer is no, on the battlefield, it's not conducive to achieving Russian objectives. That's true. But the story is not yet written of how this war ends and what happens after this war ends. So there's a great deal of concern in Ukraine that if Ukraine leaves this war without any security guarantees and with the threat of another war to follow, where Russia rearms during a brief interwar period, then it still remains a country in existential danger, and a lot of people might leave Ukraine for the West, right? And so I think I don't want to raise kind of negative scenarios, but these are things I hear from Ukrainian colleagues and friends. This is what's on their mind. So I think it's easy in the West to say, look, the war is a strategic failure for Russia. That was the narrative of the Biden administration in 2022. I think some folks maybe were sort of counting their chickens a bit early before they hatched, for lack of a better cliche phrase, that in conventional wars, once it's clear that both sides commit to a prolonged conventional war, you really want to wait to see how the story ends. You don't want to call it in the first year of the war, because year one will look different from year two, and year three will look different from year two, right? So you got to be very careful in that regard. And the way I look at it, I think it's deeply unlikely that Russia will be able to destroy Ukrainian sovereignty or Ukrainian nationhood on the one hand. On the other hand, while the way the war is going doesn't look like it's going to end in something that looks like a victory for Russia. If you just think about their political objectives, but also the cost they've paid for what they're trying to achieve. On the other hand, I am deeply skeptical that anybody in the West will look at how this war played out as a success story. And that's not what I see from lots of other countries in Europe who have seen basically where we've ended up in 2025. You're not going to find a lot of people that will point to the current situation and say, this is what success looks like.
I think one other outcome that or takeaway that I'm taking away from what you were saying about the main challenges that Ukraine is facing, because it's personnel rather than equipment, that would mean to me that also kind of limits of how much the West can help Ukraine to do those things and how much we can look to the West for it to solve it. But a bigger part of it is actually on Ukraine, which shouldn't be a reason to absolve West of its responsibility or say that they can't do anything. But it is probably the fact that the West can only do so much. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is Ukraine's war first and foremost. And although Western material assistance and other forms of support have been very important, like if you look at how the war is played out, Ukrainian will to fight was a necessary and decisive element, but not a sufficient one. Without material and intelligence support, Ukraine would very likely have lost the war much sooner. And everyone in Ukraine acknowledges that. That said, we are now where we are in the war, not just because of Western constraints or slowness in providing material assistance. It's also because that there are challenges on the Ukrainian side that only Ukraine and Ukrainian leadership could solve. And where we are now is not because of a deficit of equipment or deficit of ammunition being provided to Ukraine or insufficient air defense. We are now because of these challenges with force reconstitution, mobilization, and force management and these decisions. And these are things that Ukrainians, I think, appreciate. It's interesting, Ukrainian analysts and experts are much more frank about their problems and have been over the last year, from what I've seen, than many Western commentators. And increasingly, I see two wars emerging: the actual war, and the way Ukrainians are talking about the war and the problems they see, and let's say the rosy-eyed vision that some Western commentators continue to paint and keep trying to frame it as being just about the weapons. Well, most weapons people have wanted to see introduced in this war at this point have been introduced. And the folks that kept making the argument that we just need more Western weapons, or we need this particular type of Western weapon, or we need this specific capability, and that's going to be decisive. My views on this are pretty firm. Capabilities are most decisive. They have their biggest impact when they're first introduced at scale. What you can get out of them is an impact at the operational level if you're able to take advantage of their introduction in that period of time. Because if they are in a support of an offensive or defensive operation, then they will drive a cycle of adaptation and the adversary to develop counters. So they're going to be far less effective a year later into the war than when they were first introduced. I think in U.S. and amongst European colleagues as well, because of political constraints, we've done fairly poorly, not in all cases, but in some prominent ones, in introducing capabilities at scale at a time when you could actually take advantage of their presence on the battlefield, right? There's a lot of this, I think, is well-worn territory, and I won't get into it. Those grievances are fair. But the key decisions on military strategy, how to employ forces, and in general, when you look at mobilization, training, summer offensive 2023, and key operations have been on the Ukrainian side. And that's also the case. Yes, West has to some extent structured those choices. I think there's a balance of it, but I don't like the blame game. I think it's unhelpful on one hand. And I also don't like the stab in the back narrative, which increasingly is emerging. And it's also very unhelpful. I don't know any country to whom stab in the back narratives were productive for their society, or for historical memory, right? And the proposition that the West stabbed Ukraine in the back, I think the West certainly did not do everything it could and didn't do it at the right time. That's very fair. I think given the lofty rhetoric of what people said were the stakes in this war compared to what folks actually did, I'm an American, so I have a tendency to blame Europeans more for this. Well, incidentally, the war's in Europe, so you would think that Europeans would be far more seized of the security implications for their continent, right? But we'll put that aside, right? Meaning, looking at the resources that Europe committed and how long it took them to make those decisions versus the stakes of the war for Europe, that's where I think probably one of the biggest rhetoric to actual action gaps I saw was. But in fairness, you could say there's blame to go around. That said, I don't like this deterministic pessimism. The war is not over. Ukraine still stands a solid shot of stabilizing the front line. The Russian military have been making increasingly stronger gains in 2024, but we don't know if those trends are going to continue. If Ukraine can get through the first half of this year, the material constraints on the Russian side, which we should talk about a bit, both manpower and equipment, are going to increasingly bite at the Russian war effort. And the Russian hand, their actual position in this war, is much weaker than they are portraying it to be. Certainly much weaker relative to their demands. Let's put it this way. If you look at their maximalist goals compared to combat performance, right, they simply don't align. I think it's also fair to say that there's a huge gradient, between winning and losing a war and the likely outcome, which is what we're now looking at. Can Ukraine achieve war termination, end to the war in favorable terms? Or if that's not possible, on terms that are at least acceptable, and don't fundamentally make those big compromises for Ukraine that then force people to ask, well, what was the point of fighting for 3 years if this is what we ended up actually compromising on?
Just a quick break here to let you know that the corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. Thank you, Conductor, for sponsoring this podcast. And now, back to the conversation. Yeah, I couldn't agree more with a lot of things you said. I think that there are two discussions, and that the one in Ukraine, led by Ukrainians, is a little more realistic than the one in the West. And also the one in the West tends to be either very catastrophic and overly pessimistic, or extremely optimistic and with rosy tinted glasses. So, and I think that's pretty dangerous because it influences the way the decisions we take. But I wanted to ask more about the Russian personnel problems, but before that, I wanted to go on a little tangent and talk about when what you mentioned about the first 30 days of the war. And I wanted to ask you about that. If we go back to that time, and I'd like to hear your view in hindsight, how close do you think that Russia was actually in those 30 days to pulling off its initial war aim of quick military victory, followed by an imposed pro-Russian government? And to what extent do you think it was about a few perhaps accidental things that could have went a different way than they did? Or to what extent do you think that it was almost certain that it had ended up happening the way it did?
Here's what I mean on the first few days. I think there are a lot of wrong impressions that came out of the first 30 days of the war, even the first year, and unfortunately they stuck around. And early impressions have anchoring effects, right? And then it takes a very long time to correct those narratives. It is problematic because it takes us a long time to establish what actually happened and why in the war, right? If you are a student of military history like I am, we are still debating what happened in World War II and World War I. And I have historian friends that still debate what happened in the Napoleonic Wars. And I have other friends that still debate what happened during the period of Kabinetskrieg all the time. Okay. So that's why I would say when it comes to defense and military analysis, be patient with mil analysts following this war in trying to establish what happened yesterday or a year ago. If we're still having these debates about World War II and revisionist narratives and people trying to explain to other historians how the war was won, and then them explaining to themselves again how the war was really won. So we look at first 30 days. I think we do know quite a bit. Part of the reason why is we have a lot of primary source evidence. We have a lot of accounts from Russian and Ukrainian sides, and we have enough to establish most of what I think we need to know, although there are still missing gaps about certain battles. First is it's clear that the Russian plan, the way they're employing the forces, is very different from the way folks had expected, including myself. Meaning there was a good sense and the right call on the scope of the Russian operation, what they were trying to achieve, right? But not the way they were actually going to go about it, what their assumptions were, how they would employ their forces. That said, on the Ukrainian side, a big part of the assumption for why Ukraine would lose the conventional war, initial period of war, and this was my view as well. In my mind, I was ballparking that the initial phase could last anywhere between 4 to 8 weeks, and this was clearly wrong. I want to be clear. I don't believe anybody other than Mark Milley thought that Russians could take Kiev in 3 days. It's just a myth. I don't think there's any assessment that's going to substantiate that because it sounds a bit silly. And it's important to keep in mind that what senior political leaders said, because of the urgency of the Russian invasion and focusing on a worst case scenario, a lot of people did that. And I did that to some extent myself in the run up to the war, was because in our own country, in the United States, there were many people that didn't think this war was still going to happen, despite all the intelligence that was out there. Second, Europeans didn't agree and had a different interpretation, especially the Germans and the French, right? So it was very difficult to galvanize a response to a likely Russian invasion if your leading allies say, I don't think an invasion is going to happen. The German chief of intelligence is in Kiev on the night of the invasion. He is so confident that the U.S. is wrong that he's actually there that night and has to figure out how to get out of Kiev once the Russian assault comes, right? And that has to do with the history of Iraq. And folks were strong proponents of that invasion and the basis for that invasion that led to a lot of U.S. credibility issues for the following 20 years. That's a conversation for another time. So the other big issue is that Ukrainian government was in denial. Abject denial about the fact that the war was coming, and a lot of folks in the Ukrainian military thought that if the war would come, it would be focused on the Donbass. So there wasn't really much of anybody defending Kiev other than the presidential brigade, a couple special forces units that night, a night of invasion, and you had a lot of Ukrainian units focused in the east, in the Donbass part of the country, but much of the rest of the country unprepared. Air defense units that only got sorted out of garrison that night. To say that Ukraine was prepared to receive a large-scale invasion from Russia on that night in February is just patently false. And even if you look at the initial Russian strike campaign against Ukrainian air defense, that night they hit every known radar position. Many Ukrainian air defense units got out within hours or minutes of Russian missiles arriving to where the radars were located. If you look at sort of Russian expectations, they thought they were going to catch Ukraine cold because mobilization was only declared a few days before, and units were sorted out by the Ukrainian leadership that day. That is the day of the invasion. Ukrainian reserves were still in the western part of the country. This is a big challenge. I'm sorry, it's a bit of a longer story, but if we were to trade places, right, and you were trying to think through expectation assumptions for the war, it's true that quite a bit was contingent, and there was a tendency to emphasize worst-case scenarios. And part of that was, again, because there was still a state of denial. And many of my friends who were in Kiev from journalist circles were sending pictures of themselves drinking that night, saying, hey, where's the war? And I was sort of wide-eyed looking at it, thinking, okay, well, we are existing in two states of realities, and my reality is about to crash into my colleague's reality. Okay. But quite a bit was contingent. And the reason for that was, first, although there was no good way to assess what the Russian intelligence operation and their ground game in Ukraine, which was significant. They had operatives and saboteurs in place. They had moved them 6 to 8 months before the launch of the invasion. They rented apartments for them across the outskirts of Kiev and other areas. There are reasons for why the south fell very rapidly in the first 24 hours, and Mariupol was encircled within hours of the invasion, and why Russian forces advanced relatively unopposed until they got halfway from Kherson to Nikolaev, and why they took Luhansk so quickly too. If you look at how differently that campaign went in the south and southeast compared to how it went in the north and northeast of the country, there were things that Russians thought they had paid for that happened that clearly broke their way, if that makes any sense. That is, they did not hallucinate the intelligence operation they had and the people they thought they had paid off. And Ukraine conducted extensive investigations afterwards to figure out what happened to try to roll up this network. So it's difficult to factor it. But the military operation didn't make sense if they hadn't set the conditions for this rapid takeover, and they hadn't set the conditions. It collapsed. And they were woefully optimistic about what they could achieve. They were trying to do something closer to a large-scale annexation of Crimea or kind of like a cheaper knockoff of Operation Danube, the seizure of Czechoslovakia. But the key battles, Hostomel, the first 24 hours, the battle for Chernihiv, where 1st Tank Brigade with National Guard, Territorial Defense, and other support held off a lot of the Central Military District. Those were key battles that went Ukraine's way early on, and those outcomes were not overdetermined. And folks tend to assume that whatever timeline they live in, right, was the most likely, the highest probability outcome of history. But that's not true. You don't know for a fact that you're not living in the 20% probability outcome, right? So it may seem natural to you looking back in history that, let's say 1940, Germany defeats Britain and France in a matter of weeks, right, on the Western Front. But I don't think anybody would have called that in 1939. Certainly Britain and France didn't. If you look at all the available metrics, Britain and France should have been able to hold Germany off, right? At least that was their assumption. Not too many analytical accounts in the run up to 1940 saying that Germany is going to defeat France and we're going to get Dunkirk, right, in a matter of weeks. So I'm just using this as a example of contagion history. Now that history kind of makes sense, it's locked into our memory, right? But it could have gone another way. So when I look back on all of this, yes, the outcome was quite contingent. Ukrainian colleagues, many of them who were there and in these battles, agreed that, not to paraphrase Wellington, but it was a damn close thing, the way it played out. In retrospect, while they asked, how could you think that we would have lost within a few days? I say, well, you should have heard yourself in those first few days. You weren't sure how it was going to go. You were pretty uncertain. So, and everybody I know was too. But the Russian campaign was deeply problematic. There were a lot of problems in Russian force quality and force employment. That said, a lot of the challenges were not due to our gross overestimation of Russian military capability, right? Because remember, abstract assessments of military power is context dependent. It really depends on the scenario. There's no such thing as like an abstract measure of military power. You could be off on what you think a military can do because you haven't seen it or you haven't seen it in that particular context. That's true. I think we got a lot wrong about the Russian military and course corrected pretty quickly. But I think some folks read way too much into what happened in the first 30 days and sort of misunderstood why it happened that way. And then assumed that the entire field of kind of Russian military analysis was off and that we don't know anything about Russian military. And lastly, a lot of the thinking, I think, back then was in part due to poor knowledge of the Ukrainian forces, but also fairly weak preparation on the Ukrainian side, at least what you could observe. So it's been very hard. Now, if we were to have this discussion, right, on the night leading up to February 24th, and we were to look objectively at the state of Ukraine military preparation to receive this invasion, I think you would have been very hard-pressed as an analyst to explain why you think Ukraine will easily defeat the Russian invasion, other than you have really positive vibes about the situation. Right? And so I think that's the other challenge when I look back on it. I do think quite a bit of it was contingent, and I do think that there were big factors like many volunteers on the Ukrainian side that stalled the Russian advance, that came forward, that took up arms, and it was Ukrainian society that bought invaluable time for the rest of the military effort in those early days. And there were a lot of things that I don't think we necessarily expected, or maybe expected but didn't know how to account for. And here I'm speaking to myself just as an outside objective analyst. I was not involved in any of the government assessments of this thing in the run-up to it.
When you said that in the field of Russian military analysis, there was course correction to adapt for the real Russian military performance, do you think there was overcorrection in that sense? That at least some people went really from overestimating Russian military to really maybe underestimating the Russian military?
Absolutely. And unfortunately, adversary assessments often are a pendulum swing between the adversary being 12 feet tall and 4 feet tall, right? So I assure you that if in the first military operation attempt, the Chinese military does quite poorly, people will quickly shift the pendulum in another direction. It tends to go like this. What folks kind of who got into this conversation just in 2022 don't appreciate is that for most of the Cold War period, Russians were seen as demoralized, often drunk, incapable, as a very poorly performing conventional force through the 90s and 2000s, right? Then there was a big correction in 2014 and 2015 in the military and local community based on what happened in the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the Russian intervention in Syria. Now, I think it's fair to say that we overcorrected too much in terms of what we thought the Russian military could then do from 2017 onward, right? But it was difficult to tell, meaning you're getting glimpses, only seeing pieces of the puzzle. So then there was another big overcorrection in 2022, where folks said, look, this military can't do any of these things. And it's true. Russians had a huge gap between theory and practice of what they could actually execute. And then we got much more into a conversation where I think people grossly underestimated the Russian military's staying power and also their ability to adapt. And that was very visible in the assumptions and expectations going into the summer 2023 offensive. And a lot of folks, I think, may have overinterpreted what happened in 2022. And I won't give my thoughts on how much I think that was an input into the planning of 2023, but I think it was rather optimistic. I think the planning for 2023 was rather optimistic, and the concept of operations were quite unrealistic, given what both forces looked like at that point in May and June of that year. And I think it is unfortunate that we still have a conversation where the Russian military analysis field has been very introspective. By the way, this is a subfield. This is a subfield that really combines a couple communities, right? Folks who are in security studies and strategy studies in general. And most of the people who do Russian military analysis are defense analysts who are generalists that tend to just have a specialty, like a specialization of subfield, because Russian military analysis is a subfield, right? It combines defense analysis and area studies. That's it's an interdisciplinary subfield. That's it. It's not it's not a curriculum you're going to find. It's sort of in a school, right? Not that I'm aware of, at least, right? And so the way I look at it is that the field definitely was quite introspective and thinking through a lot what had gotten wrong in the Russian invasion, despite calling the invasion correctly and that it was going to happen, but getting the initial outcome quite wrong. But views got formed pretty firmly after those early days in 2022. So I very much agree with you. It's been a struggle to correct that view. And I was writing early in 2022 that before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I have spent kind of a long time in arguments explaining to people that Russians were not 12 feet tall. This was because of the post-2015 overcorrection that I described. Right? After 2022, I was saying that I'm going to spend the next 10 years explaining to people that Russians are not 4 feet tall. And then who knows, if I'm still doing this professionally, probably the 10 years after that, I'll be back to explaining to folks that they're not 12 feet tall again, because they'll have some successful military operation and people will say, as you said, there's a tendency to vacillate between two extremes. Either gloom and doom, it's all over, or, quote unquote, we're back. So in looking at this war, but also in assessing adversary capabilities.
I think the point you made about thinking of it as living in different timelines that have had different probabilities, and it might not be that the one we're living in was the most likely one. That's a really good point. I think also I'd rather prepare to fight a 12 feet tall giant and then face a 4 feet one. So I think maybe it's always better to overestimate. But I wanted to get back to the present and ask one more thing that we've sort of hinted on, and that's we've mentioned Ukrainian personnel issues, and I wanted to ask about the Russian side of that, because Russia has so far been fairly successful in mobilizing volunteers through really high bonus payments and incentives, but at the same time, the Russian personnel losses have been increasing gradually, especially this year. Do we know how many people are Russians able to recruit today, and if they're actually able to replace the losses that they are incurring today at this rate, or even expand the current military, because that's also the plan, I think, that they have. Thank you for listening to the first part of this episode. If you want to help me make more of these interviews, which take surprising amount of time and effort, and hear the second part, you can do that by becoming a supporter on Patreon. There's over 30 minutes of this conversation left in the second part, where we talk about whether and when might Russia start to run out of soldiers, how quickly they will be able to recover after the war, or how much of a threat they will pose to NATO once the war is over. But whether you decide to become a supporter or not, thank you for being here, and I'll see you next time.